President Obama. Now, I want to address one last point, and that is that it has been argued that what the majority leader is proposing, that is that we, if necessary, change the rule or change the application of the rule in order to make this place work again, is unprecedented.
Senator's time has expired.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you. I have in my hand a document, the Senate's power to make procedural rules by majority vote. Now, this lays out a whole host of viewpoints expressed in 2005 that I think would be interesting reading for my colleagues across the aisle because it was their document. I also have a long list of cases where every other year, on average, we have changed the application of a rule in order to make the Senate function in a different way, a better way. So this is far from unprecedented. It is time for us together, as U.S. Senators, to do our responsibility and restore the power to the executive branch to put their folks in place, operating our advise and consent in the way envisioned in the Constitution. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders. I would ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I come today to speak about the rules issue that has come to a head here in the Senate. We have seen unprecedented obstruction by the other side of the aisle. They have continually blocked the nominations, and I'll get into the numbers here. But this is something that has been building since we came in this Congress. We had a debate about rules. We didn't do the things that we should have done. We should have put in place a talking filibuster. There's no doubt about it. We should have put in other rules changes. And now what has happened is we find ourselves in the situation of a tyranny of the minority. And what is a tyranny of the minority? The founders talked about it. The founders saw that if you created a situation where a minority could block the action of the Senate, then the minority would actually be governing. And that's the situation we have before us here today. The minority governs when it comes to nominees, and they blocked nominees in a very, very significant way. And this is, I can't repeat enough, unprecedented in the history of the country. The President can't get his team. I mean, what is at issue here, really, is we have a President of the United States who had a very big win in the last election. He put himself out there. He campaigned on a number of things and won the election. And so you would think, well, he could get his team in place. Well, he's unable to get his team in place. He tries to propose people, for example, talking about the Consumer Protection Agency, a very qualified attorney general. I was a former attorney general a few years back. And this young man that he put forward from Ohio, very well qualified. He has not been able to get a vote. And so he's in an agency that's tremendously important to the middle class. He's in an agency that's important to consumers. He's able to do things that are very, very important for consumers across this nation when it comes to bank loans, when it comes to safety issues, all across the board. And here now we have a situation where he cannot be sworn in and do his job as a full-time appointee for that agency. So this is it's absolutely unprecedented, and we have to tackle this issue. The thing that's happening with the minority side here is if they don't like a nominee, and they don't like the policies that the nominee stands for, they don't like the administration's policies, they prevent the nominee from taking office at all. And so, in effect, they, through the minority process that's being utilized here, are determining policy. And that's what the big objection is. And I think we're going to have to address this, and I'm very supportive of Leader Reid coming out saying we've got to address this, we've got to deal with this, and I think we're going to deal with it starting today and flowing in to the next week or so. It was mentioned here recently that the Republican Policy Committee in the past has had a document. I believe it was put into the record. If it wasn't put into the record, I would move that this document. Can I ask the chair, was the constitutional option, the Senate's power to make procedural rules by majority vote, was that put in the record? It was mentioned.
Without objection, it will be placed in the record.
It will be placed in the record. Okay. Thank you very much. It was mentioned in earlier debate, and I just wanted to make sure that that was in there. And the thing that is very clear in reading this document is that at the time of April 2005 and in that period, they were making very, very strong arguments that you could go forward during the middle of a session, and they were pointing out that Majority Leader Robert Byrd, you know, Robert Byrd was one of the senators in this institution who really studied and knew the rules. Most people believe that Robert Byrd knew the rules better than any senator in the last 100 years. And he always felt that you had the right, under the constitutional option, to make changes that needed to be made. And in 1977, 1979, 1980, and 1987, he established precedents that changed Senate procedures during the middle of a Congress. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is something along that line. So this is a critical issue for us today. As we try to move forward and we try to govern. The Democrats have a majority, and a big majority if you take the independents that have joined with us, no doubt about it, and yet we cannot govern because of the procedures that are being adopted here today. And I just want to highlight a little of the unprecedented Republican obstruction. Executive nominees who are ready to be confirmed by the Senate have been pending on an average of 260 days, more than 8 months since they were first nominated. The Senate confirmed only 34 executive nominees by the July 4th recess, compared to 118 at this point in the Bush administration. There are 184 pending executive nominees. Since President Obama took office, Senate Republicans have filibustered 16 executive nominations. 2 nominees, including Mr. Cordray, that's the consumer protection head, have been blocked via filibuster. For the first time ever, Senate Republicans filibustered a nomination for the Secretary of Defense. As the New York Times noted, and I'm quoting here, the vote represented the first time in history that the Senate has required that a nominee for Secretary of Defense clear the 60-vote hurdle before a final, simple majority vote. That's the New York Times. Senate Republicans continue to block the nomination of Gina McCarthy to be EPA Administrator, claiming she's been unresponsive. Ms. McCarthy was forced to answer more questions than ever before, more than 1,100 questions, since Senate Republicans boycotted her hearing at the committee that I serve on, the Environment and Public Works Committee. Ms. McCarthy was previously environmental advisor to Mitt Romney. She has very good credentials. I would urge my colleagues to look at what she did in New Mexico. Here you have Gina McCarthy. There's a potential for a lawsuit. It's an issue that has to do with air quality in New Mexico. She ended up pulling all the parties together through a regional administrator and reached a compromise where we closed down 2 coal-fired plants and opened up in their place 2 natural gas-fired plants. It was considered by the governor and the EPA regional administrator and everybody. This was a win-win for everyone. And she engineered that from her position at air quality there in the EPA. One of the other points that should be made about Gina McCarthy is a woman who has already been approved by the Senate. She's been approved in a lopsided vote, and she's been doing her job for 4 years. So what are we doing here? That we're saying that she has to be filibustered, she has to be stopped because they don't like the policies she's going to be put in place. So it's absolutely outrageous what's happening here, and we need to rein this in, and I agree that Senator Reid is headed in the right direction to do this. I noticed that my colleague, Senator Patty Murray, and Leader Senator Patty Murray, and our leadership team is here. I would ask that any additional comments that I have be put by consent into the record, and would applaud her for her work with Senator Reid, with the leadership team in terms of trying to address how we govern. And I thank you, Senator Murray, for your good work on that, and very much appreciate how you have tried to shape this issue, and you've tried to always work with the Republicans on this issue. We've tried to work through these things, and we haven't been able to, and so I would yield the floor.
Who yields time?
Madam President.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I appreciate the comments of my colleague from New Mexico, and clearly as a former chief executive myself, it is remarkable to me that regardless of who is President of the United States, he or she ought to be able to get their team, and they ought to be able to get their team in place in a way that, with appropriate oversight and review, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to be the case in this body at this point. But, Madam President, I rise today to make some remarks on an issue that in my 4-plus years that I've been here, I think, while many of the other debates that we have are important, in my mind at least supersedes everything else. And quite honestly, that if we could reach some resolution on, I think might go further than any other action in both lowering some of the rhetoric and lancing some of the boil of partisanship in this Senate, as well as, quite honestly, doing more for the kind of job growth that is still desperately needed. And that, Madam President, is getting our fiscal house in order, getting our balance sheet in order. We've seen some good news with an economy that recovers. We've seen our annual deficit numbers go down, although I have to be somewhat, look at somewhat jaundiced eyes when the press is saying, hallelujah, this year our deficit may only be $746 billion. That still is not good enough. And the solution set that we're looking for is not that far away. So in a moment, then I'm going to make a couple comments and then ask my colleague, the chair of our Budget Committee, to once again make an offer to proceed with regular order, something that is, again, the backstop of this debate about rules, something that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, perhaps appropriately, beat us over the head for 3 years on, about the fact that if we ought to have a regular order around the budget. Well, it's now been 110 days since the United States Senate approved a budget. After a marathon session that went till 5 in the morning, a session that I think even our colleagues on their side who didn't vote for the budget would agree was open and appropriate to rules, and everybody got their chance to have their say and offer their ideas. And now, for the 16th time, we're going to come and ask our colleagues to let's abide by regular order and go to a budget conference. Let's do the hard work that's necessary to make sure that we finish the job of getting the kind of deficit reduction, getting our balance sheet in order that will allow this economy to move forward and, quite honestly, allow us to get back to regular order on issues such as appropriation bills and the host of other things that, quite honestly, I can't speak for everyone, but people in Virginia, I would imagine people in Washington State, and I see colleagues from New Mexico and Florida and everywhere are also saying, what in the heck are you guys doing? Why can't you get something done? And every day that we remain in this paralyzed state, while it may be great late-night fodder for comedians about Congress's inability to act, at some point this dysfunction erodes the underlying confidence that the American people have in our institutions. And that is not good for American democracy, and it's not good as well for our ability for the economy to recover. Now, I want to make, again, a couple more comments and then ask the Senator from, our Chairman, Senator from Washington, to make one more appeal to our colleagues on the other side to let the regular order work. But one of the things that we've seen a lot of press reports and kind of what is starting to seep into consciousness, that the actions that were set up in sequestration, well, they don't seem to be as bad as what people thought. Let's remind ourselves that sequestration was set up to be the stupidest option possible. An option so stupid that no rational group of people would ever let it come to pass. Because any of us who've cut budgets, and I have cut budgets as governor, I've cut budgets in business, there is a smart way and a stupid way to cut a budget. We set up a process that was so stupid that no rational group would ever let it happen. Well, one of the reasons why I think our approval rating hovers around 8% is we didn't come together, we didn't let this budget process take place, and we allowed this sequestration to move forward.
Time for the majority has expired.
Time for the majority. Oh, could I ask unanimous consent for a 5-minute extension, 8-minute extension?
Extend that. I would ask unanimous consent for the Senator from Virginia to finish his statement and for me to have 8 minutes in morning business and then allow our colleagues on the other side to respond.
Is there objection?
President, I don't have
The Senator from Florida.
I don't have an objection to the time they want to use. My understanding is that we are. What's the order? What's our posture as of after 12:30?
At 12:30, the Senate will stand in recess, absent consent.
Well, I would ask consent that we be allowed to, after they're done with their remarks, I'd like 10 minutes. May have an objection, probably will, and would like to speak on that as well. So I just want to make sure we don't run out of time. So we could have consent on that. I don't intend to keep us in longer than we need to be, but I certainly want to be heard.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I thank my colleague,
Senator from Virginia.
I thank my colleague, and I will shorten my comments to make sure we get on with this. But I just want to point out the fact that we're now starting to see furloughs in the federal workforce. And let me acknowledge, there is no state in our nation that is more of ground zero, that is getting hit harder than the Commonwealth of Virginia with sequestration. And I would simply make the point that there are real people that are being hurt by this. We've talked about some of the numbers, whether it's in Head Start or NIH grants. But let me just say some of the things that I've heard in the last 2 weeks from Virginians. Pat Hickman, who works at the Department of Defense, lives here in Northern Virginia. She's quoted as saying, "I'm tired of hearing it's only one day, it's only 20%. Well, Pat is now starting to decide whether she, perhaps because of these 11 days of furlough, is going to have to start to curtail her contributions to her thrift savings plans. So her retirement will be in jeopardy. Another employee, name didn't come forward, said, as we know, during the summertime, if you have kids who are in school, they're in daycare, well, this federal employee is paying $2,000 a month for daycare. They're not getting any furlough exemption, any daycare exemption, any discount on these expenses that are built into their family budget. How could they have planned a year out that they were going to get furloughed 11 weeks in a row? A real story, a real person. Greg Granville, who works down at the shipyard in Portsmouth, says that furloughing for the next 12 weeks will hit their expenses hard. He has a wife who's currently going for treatment for an illness. The insurance company only pays half. She has to decide, you cut back on the wife's treatment, or do you go into the heart of your savings? I've got letters here and comments from Virginian after Virginian urging us, begging us to take off our Democrat and Republican hats and put the interest of our country and our countrymen first and foremost. So, Madam President, I know we've got lots of differences on how we want to approach and bridge this gap, but gosh knows, we're never going to get to bridge the gap on our differences on the debt and deficit and on the budget unless we can get to conference and try to work this out. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and want to say in strong support of our Budget Chairman, thank you for the great work that you've done in getting us a budget. Thank you for working in that in a fair way where our Republican colleagues got a chance to raise their objections. And I sure hope and pray that we'll get to that conference so we can get this issue resolved.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
Madam President, let me thank the senator from Virginia. There is no one in this body more passionate to help us do the work to get us to a balanced, bipartisan deal, to put the budget deficit and the budget issues behind us, and to get our country back on track than the senator from Virginia. I know he wants to get to a conference committee as badly as I do, not to demand that we only have our position, but to work with others to find a bipartisan solution. And as he so eloquently stated, it's been more than 100 days now since the Senate did pass a budget. And we have tried now 15 times to take the next step to move to a bipartisan conference with the House. And every time we've asked, we've been blocked by a Tea Party Republican with the support of the Republican leadership. Now, I understand that for some factions in the Republican Party, compromise is a dirty word. That may explain why they have offered up excuse after excuse for blocking the regular budget order that we are trying to work towards. They've refused to allow a conference before we get to a so-called pre-conference framework. They've demanded that we put preconditions on what can be discussed or talked about in a bipartisan conference, to claiming that moving to a budget conference, which leading Republicans, by the way, called for just months ago, was somehow now not regular order, to most recently claiming that we need to look at a 30-year budget window before we look at the major problems we've got in front of us right now, when we can and must actually do both at the same time. So, Madam President, I know there are significant differences between our party's values and our priorities. Some of us, Democrats and Republicans, think this is a reason to come together and try to reach a bipartisan deal in a budget conference now. And it's been heartening to hear from Senators McCain and Collins and many other Republicans who've chatted with me about why they believe we need to have a formal bipartisan negotiation and move on this. But unfortunately, there is a small group of senators who would prefer to throw up their hands and stall until we reach a crisis, when they think they can get a better deal. Well, Madam President, I was home in my state, like most senators last week, and I talked to a lot of Americans who don't understand that kind of approach. They run their businesses and help their communities and support their families by compromising every single day. They can't afford to wait to reach agreements until the very last minute, because when that happens, they have to deal with the consequences. But, Madam President, that is exactly what my Republican colleagues are doing to thousands of my families in the state of Washington. Because Republicans won't allow us to come to the table, the automatic cuts from sequestration are impacting everything, from children who depend on Head Start to our national security. And what's more, many of the same colleagues will try to tell you that sequestration isn't impacting American families. Well, as the senator from Virginia just talked about, I can tell you firsthand the impacts are real. And for thousands of families in my home state, these become a real reality tomorrow morning. And that's because furloughs for the Department of Defense employees begin this week, equivalent to a 20% pay cut for 650,000 defense workers nationwide. Bases in my home state of Washington are being affected, and the first furlough date at Joint Base Lewis-McChord in Washington State is tomorrow. So instead of going to work, thousands of workers in my state will stay home. The 9/11 call center and the fire department will be understaffed. Airfields are going to be shuttered except for emergencies. The military personnel office is closed. The substance abuse center is closed. And the Army Medical Center is going to close clinics. Even the wound care clinic is going to be understaffed. I'm reminded of one worker I met at home a few weeks ago, Will Silva. Will is a former Marine. He's an amputee. He works now as a fire inspector, and he told me that because of these furloughs, he's going to have to get a second job, and he's going to struggle with his mortgage payments. So these furloughs are going to directly impact thousands of people and civilian employees. And the leaders at Lewis-McChord have made it very clear that the furloughs are going to hurt our soldiers. They're going to limit their access to medical care. They're going to cut back on the family support programs. And they're going to make it tougher to find a job when they finish their military careers. Why? Because our colleagues refuse to work together, and to me this is just unacceptable. And because some Republicans would like to preserve the harmful cuts from sequestration, despite these kinds of impacts, we've got a $91 billion gap between the House and the Senate appropriations levels for next year. And if we don't resolve that gap, we're headed for another round of uncertainty and brinksmanship, another unnecessary burden on our economic recovery and the millions of Americans who look for work every day. So some of my Republican colleagues say they're fine with that. In fact, House Republicans are reported right now to be busy working on a debt limit ransom note right now. And so far that ransom note sounds a lot like the Ryan budget. Now, as you all know, the budget that we did pass here in the Senate was very different. But that, Madam President, is exactly why we have to resolve our differences in a conference. That's where we come together in a public fashion and talk about our differences and work out agreements. Now, I believe we have an opportunity, a window of opportunity over the next few weeks to do what Americans across the country have asked us to do, compromise, and confront these problems before we head back home to our states for the work period in August. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm confident that if those of us who can see working together as a responsibility rather than a liability come to the table and get a fair bipartisan agreement. And by the way, Madam President, I was very discouraged to hear just this week from some Tea Party Republicans, many of the same ones who are now blocking us going to conference, who are already talking now about shutting down the government in order to defund Obamacare. Not only do they want to push us to a crisis, but they want to do that in order to cut off health care coverage for 25 million people and reopen that donut hole that we know so much about, causing seniors to pay more for their prescriptions and end preventive care for seniors, and the list goes on. So, Madam President, this is an absurd position. We should not be talking about shutting down the government, and I really hope that responsible Republicans reject this approach and work with us on real solutions, not more political fights. So my colleagues and I are going to continue urging the Senate Republican leadership to end their Tea Party-backed strategy of manufacturing crises and allow us to do the work we were sent here to do and go to a conference. And I urge them to listen not just to Democrats, but to many members of their own party who want to get to a budget conference and allow us to get to work to solve the nation's problems. So today I come to the floor to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment, which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate. That following the authorization, two motions to instruct conferees be in order from each side, the motion to instruct relative to the debt limit and a motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue. There'd be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to the votes in relation to the motions, and that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate. And I ask that unanimous consent today.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Florida.
Thank you, Madam President. Reserving the right to object, I do not oppose going to a budget conference with the House. And I think I have shown, especially in the last week, a willingness and an ability to compromise on important issues, like one that was, quite frankly, very unpopular among people who were very, very supportive of my candidacy and of my time here in the Senate when we dealt with the issue of immigration. My concern is that when this goes to a budget conference with the House, that they will negotiate the debt limit, an issue that I believe is so monumental to the country that it should be debated on its own merits and by itself. So what I am proposing, what I'm arguing for, is a compromise. Let's go to conference, but let's assure everyone here that this is not a conference that's going to deal with the debt limit. We need to deal with that issue separately. So I would ask unanimous consent from the senator if she would modify her request on a compromise. Let's compromise on this. I ask unanimous consent that the senator modify her request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit.
Madam President.
Does the senator so modify her request?
Madam President, I will object, but let me just say this, that what the senator is requesting, that we tell our conferees before they ever get to the Senate Conference Committee what they're going to do on a specific issue. Now, what I offered in my original offer is to have a vote on that, which is how we do this here. The senator is requesting not that we have a vote, but that we have a demand. Now, I respect the senator from Florida. He has worked very hard, as he stated, on immigration reform. He is working now to try and get the House to pass that at some point. They will go to conference. What he is saying is when his bill goes to conference, what he wants to do is to allow any senator on this floor make a demand of that conference committee before they get there, not a vote, not a majority vote, but a demand from a small minority of what's going to be in that conference. Madam President, we cannot agree to that. What I have offered is a vote on that, which is what we are, a democracy. You are allowed to vote, and if enough senators agree with that position, that is what we would direct the conference to do. But this body is not built on a demand from one senator or a small group of senators on a conference before we go there. We are a democracy. So I again would object to his request, as he said, and renew my request, which will allow a debate and a vote on that issue that he is requesting, as happens in a democracy.
Objection is heard to the modification. Is there objection to the original request?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senator from Florida.
How much time do I have remaining?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. And let me just say at the outset that on this debt limit issue, we've been told by everyone here that the debt limit is not going to be dealt with, that they don't intend to deal with it, that in fact we have rules in place that prohibit that from happening. So if the intent is to say we're not going to deal with the debt limit, why not just put it in writing? Why not just agree to it? I think it raises suspicion that they refuse to take the debt limit off the table in writing and in the specific motion, even though they've told us that that's not the case. But I want to raise a couple of points in regards to all of this debate that we're having. We've heard a lot about the impact of the sequester on our country, and I don't dispute that it will have an impact. In fact, I voted against the deal that actually gave us the sequester. And I voted against it because while I believe deeply that we need to constrain spending, because we're spending a lot more money than we're taking in, about $1 trillion a year more than what we're taking in, borrowing about 40 cents of every dollar that we spend in the federal government. And for the folks visiting here in the gallery, you may be shocked to hear that. Every dollar the federal government spends, 40 cents of it is borrowed. When you borrow it, that means you've got to pay it back with interest. That's your money. That doesn't come from a tree. That's money that taxpayers are eventually going to have to come up with. And for the younger folks that are here today, I want you to understand it's primarily going to come from you. It's primarily going to come from you in the years to come. And so the reason why I thought the sequester was a bad idea was because that sequester is going after things that by and large are not the drivers of our debt. The drivers of our debt are certain programs that are built in a way that are unsustainable. Important programs like Medicare. I believe in Medicare. I support Medicare. As I tell anyone when they ask me about it, my mother is on Medicare. I don't want to see Medicare hurt or changed for her. But I also recognize that if Medicare is going to exist when I retire, we better start making some changes to it for future retirees, people 20 or 30 years from now. That's where we should be focusing our reform efforts. And we can't get the other side to agree on any sort of changes. There was an effort in the House last year to do something serious about it, and they brutally attacked it. There was a reference to the Ryan budget a moment ago. The Ryan budget, I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was the most serious effort yet in this Congress, in this House, in this city, to reform a program that's going bankrupt on its own. So I think the only thing worse than the sequester is to raise taxes to prevent the sequester, because that will hurt job creation in America. The only thing worse than the sequester is not to have any spending reductions at all. Which leads me to the point about, that was raised earlier about saying that we're not going to agree to a short-term budget unless Obamacare is defunded, and that we're threatening a crisis by shutting down the government. Well, let me say that one of the people who has said that is me, so let me address that for a moment. Let me tell you what the disaster is. The real disaster is Obamacare itself. And in fact, it is such a disaster that the people who supported it are now delaying implementing portions of it. Just last week we were told that one of the key components of the law, requiring that employers provide insurance, they're going to have to delay that by a year, conveniently till after the next election. Here's the other thing we found out last week. Because under Obamacare, when you go in and say, I make so much money, you can qualify for the government to give you extra money to buy insurance. Well, guess what? They've now admitted they have no way of verifying how much money you really make. Basically means people are going to get to show up and say, I only make $20,000 a year, and get their subsidy with no way to verify the truth about how much they make or not. But it's not limited to that. I mean, the disaster that is looming with regards to Obamacare impacts every single American. Here's a list of them that was recently produced by the Heritage Foundation. They've missed a bunch of deadlines. Most states resisted Obamacare's call to create insurance exchanges, choosing to let Washington create a federally run exchange instead. However, a Government Accountability Office report released last month noted that critical activities to create a federal exchange have not been completed, and the missed deadline suggests a potential for challenging going forward. That's right. You may have to go onto a federal exchange, including, by the way, ironically enough, members of Congress and their staff. The exchange doesn't exist yet. You're going to be expected in a couple months to sign up for something that doesn't even exist yet. That's one part of the disaster. There are many others. The administration announced in April that workers will not be able to choose plans from different health insurers in the Small Business Exchange next year, a delay that a liberal blogger called a really bad sign of Obamacare incompetence. Here's another one, the child-only plans, one of the things people were very excited about. There was a drafting error in the law that actually led to less access to care for children with pre-existing conditions. A 2011 report found that in 17 states, insurers are no longer selling child-only health insurance plans because they fear that individuals will apply for coverage only after being diagnosed with costly illnesses. Basic health care plan, delayed. The government-run plans for states created as part of Obamacare has also been delayed, prompting one Democrat to criticize the administration for, quote, failing to live up to the law and implement it as written. The early retiree reinsurance, it's broke. The $5 billion in funding for this program was intended to last until 2014, but the program ran out of money in 2011, 2 years ahead of schedule. Waivers. After the law passed, HHS discovered that some of its new mandates would raise costs so much that employers would drop coverage rather than face skyrocketing premiums. And so instead, the administration announced a series of temporary waivers. And guess what? More than half of the recipients of those waivers were members of a union health insurance plan. It goes on and on. This thing is a disaster. I don't care about how you feel about it. Look, there's an insurance crisis in America. Let there be no doubt. People are struggling to find access to quality health insurance. We should deal with that. But this approach is a disaster. No matter how you feel about it, it's a disaster. It cannot be implemented in time. And you don't think that's looming over our economy? I just left a meeting right now with an owner of a chain of restaurants. They're worried about it. They don't know what to make of it yet. If you ask them, what's it going to look like for you next year, they don't know. They don't know. We're in July already, folks. And we're going to implement this? We're going to force this on our economy? You don't think that's a disaster? You don't think that in the real world, not here in Washington or in the think tanks, you don't think that in the real world, small, mid-sized businesses and individuals are holding back on investing, are holding back on making moves? You don't think that someone who's decided, you know what, I'm going to leave my job, take my life savings, and open up a new business because I believe so much in my dream, you don't think that this uncertainty is hurting that from happening? It is. And you cannot grow your economy unless people are willing to start new businesses or grow existing businesses, and Obamacare is keeping that from happening. That's the disaster. Why would we fund a disaster? Why would we pay for something out of the American taxpayer's wallet that we know isn't going to work? So when they talk about shutting down the government, it's going to be a disaster. Obamacare threatens to shut down our economy. And so I'm telling you, this is a disaster, and we should not fund. We should not have a temporary budget around here that gives money to this thing, because it's a disaster and it won't work, and it's going to hurt people. The other thing about this debt limit that I make such a big deal about, let me tell you why. We owe $17 trillion. That's bad. That's bigger than our economy. But here's the worst part about it. There is no plan in place to ever stop that from continuing to grow. You heard right. There is no plan. This budget the Senate passed, I'm glad we passed the budget. It only makes it worse. It doesn't make it better. Where is the urgency? Where's the urgency? What are we waiting for? This isn't going to take care of itself. We're not going to win the Powerball lottery here and pay this thing off. When is someone going to step up and say it's time to solve it? I've been here now 2.5 years. If on the day I got elected you told me we'd go 2.5 years without seriously dealing with this, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said, look, I know it's going to be hard, but we've got to do something. We are now 2.5 years into this, and what they're saying is we're going to want to raise the debt limit, and we don't want any conditions. We don't want to deal with anything that fixes it. And people say, well, the debt is something that's off far in the future. It is. It is off in the future, but it's also happening now. You think when people decide I'm going to invest money to start a new business or expand an existing business, which is how you create jobs. That's how jobs are created in the private sector. If you graduated college, you went to school, you got your degree, and now you can't find a job, I'm going to tell you why you can't find a job, because the businesses that create those jobs won't create them until all of this is figured out. People do not want to risk their hard-earned and saved money in an economy that is headed for catastrophe. Look at what's happening in Europe now. They have a debt problem. And you know how they've had to deal with it? Disruptive changes in government and tax increases. And if you think that stuff attracts investment and business, you're out of your mind. There isn't a chamber of commerce in the world that tells people, come to us. Here we have high taxes and heavy debt that will make those taxes even bigger in the future. So the bottom line is the debt limit and the fact that we don't have a solution for the debt, that is also the crisis. And we need to begin to deal with these things seriously and stop playing games around here. And someone has to draw a line in the sand, and I know that me and many of my colleagues intend to do so every chance we get. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum. No?
Will the senator withhold that suggestion?
Yes. Are we just going to go to...
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
So the U.S. Senate is gavelled out for now, but members are expected to return at 2:15 Eastern to continue work on a bill aimed at addressing the doubling of student loan interest rates. Senators reached a compromise on that measure last night, and a final passage vote could take place early next week. The chamber in recess now for caucus lunches where members could discuss the Senate's filibuster rules. Majority Leader Harry Reid is expected to take the floor at 2:15 Eastern today, and it's possible he'll discuss judicial nominations and a revision of Senate rules so that efforts to block nominations from coming to the floor can be defeated with a majority vote rather than requiring 60 votes. Live coverage of the U.S. Senate will continue here on C-SPAN 2 when members gavel back in. This afternoon, the